All right, students, welcome back as we continue to talk about the 13 colonies. Just want to go back and do a quick review. Glad to see Nearpod's working as fast as it has been recently. Here we go. So we talked about what a colony is. A colony is a territory that's governed by another country. And we were mostly concerned with the 13 colonies, and they are the 13 English colonies, so they were controlled by England. We talked about the meeting house. That was their building that was used for public assembly. It was used for religious services. It was kind of like the town hall. It was the main place in the middle of the town where they made the biggest decisions regarding the town, and that's also where they had their services on Sunday mornings as well. We talked at length about the New England colonies: Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. Maine was actually a part of Massachusetts back then. And some of the things that we talked about the New England colony was the fact that they weren't able to do a lot of farming. Now, they did farm, and they had like small farms, but they certainly didn't have big enough farms to have what we called cash crops. They had barely enough from their farms to help sustain their families. There was no extra when they were farming, and that was for many different reasons. Number one, the weather there was not fantastic. Very, very long, pretty brutal winters, short spring and summer, and it didn't allow them a lot of time to grow things because you need nice warm weather in order for plants to survive and grow. The soil there is pretty terrible, very, very rocky soil, so it wasn't really good for growing things in general. However, they had a few things that they were had plenty of, and that would be timber or trees to chop down. And they, obviously, as you can tell here, they lived near the water, so they had a lot of fish, and they did some whaling that time as well. We dug a little bit into some of the first people into the New England colonies, the Puritans. They were getting really kind of tired of the king telling them what to do as far as how they can worship, and they wanted to have that thing that we talked about, that freedom of religion. So they did not want to worship the way the king was telling them to. They wanted to worship in their own way. So one of the reasons why they got on the boat to come over here was because they feared the persecution that would occur if they decided to continue to worship their own way, and they also wanted to have that freedom of religion. Again, freedom of religion is the ability to practice your religion the way you want to without the fear of punishment. Man, I hope it's not this slow in class. The winters in New England, again, like I said, were cold and harsh. The soil was pretty terrible. And again, because of that, they went through lumber. The men were like lumberjacks. They would cut down trees. Those trees were used to build homes. Those trees were used to build ships. Those trees were what they used. Once they chopped them down, they sold the lumber in order to make money. They also fished and hunted whales in order to make money as well. These New England areas, they had these ports. Pretty sure we'll get to that here in just a moment. And these ports were like major areas for trading and bartering and the shipment of goods coming in and the shipment of goods that they were getting together for other areas going out. And here's the port, a town or a city where ships stop to load and unload goods. And that's a very important thing. So a lot of these New England colonies were located near ports. We watched this awesome video with that mean little brother. And now we're going to dig into the middle colonies. We didn't really get into it a whole bunch. And I know on Wednesday we're going to dig into this a little bit more as well. But the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, which is, I would still consider up north. If someone said they were going on a trip to Pennsylvania, I would say they're going up north. That is pretty far north. But at the time, this was the quote-unquote middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. If you lived in the middle colonies at that time, you had a better opportunity to come across a very diverse population of people. Remember, up north, we had a lot of Puritans that had moved there in order for them to practice their religious freedoms. In the middle colonies, you had people that lived here from many, many, many different European backgrounds. And if you think about it, New York is still kind of like that now. It's a giant melting pot of cultures and backgrounds. But there were Dutch and Scot-Irish, Scandinavians, German, and French. There wasn't like one very set specific religion practiced in the middle colonies. There were different religions. You had Quakers, Lutherans, Mennonites, Presbyterians, and Jews. Some people who came to the middle colonies didn't even bring their families with them. They were here to work and make money. Whether they were here to make money to pay off a debt that they owed, or they were just here, as most people do, to have a job and get money. And so they worked in the factories. There were a lot of factories there. Still quite a few factories in these areas if we think about it. We didn't talk about this as much up north. There was slavery up north, but it wasn't as predominant. And as we keep getting further and further south, we're going to notice that we're going to see that slavery becomes more and more common. There were slaves in the middle colonies. They worked as laborers, they were servants, they worked in homes, they were drivers, and they were sailors. And again, if we go back and look at our definitions of slavery, that is somebody who is forced to work and they're treated pretty terribly and they get no pay for that whatsoever. So this is not like your indentured servant. That's a little different. Indentured servant says, oh, I owe this person X amount of money. I'm going to go over here and work in the colonies until I have earned enough money to pay my debt off, and then they go back to where they came from. Slaves were taken against their will to go do work that they weren't necessarily wanting to do, and they weren't getting paid for it, and they were treated pretty awfully during that time as well. So this was a little bit more common in the middle colonies, and it's going to be extremely common as we get down to the southern colonies. The middle colonies was kind of nice. The climate was a little warmer. The soil a little bit better. Pretty decent farming in the middle colonies. Colonists could actually grow more crops, and instead of just having enough for their family, they had enough for their family and to sell. And they grew things like grains and barley, oats and rye. Big things that are important in the production of breads. Because of this large supply of grains, the middle colonies earned the nickname the bread basket, which kind of makes sense. What do you put in a bread basket? Bread. Well, this area grew a lot of the things that were needed to make bread. But again, that wasn't the only thing that they did in the middle colonies. They also had giant factories, iron factories, paper factories, textiles, where they would create cloth and fabric for clothing. There was glass that was produced in the factories here in the middle colonies. Again, all things that people needed in all three colonies. It's just what they specialized in the middle colonies. Merchants would come here to buy and sell goods. Artisans were people who were skilled at making things by hand, like a blacksmith who would bend metal to create different things. So they might take iron and things like that. You had shoemakers that would come to these areas as well. So I know that when you take your trips to Old Salem, there's a shop there. It's like a shoemaker shop and a hat maker shop. These were a little bit more common in the middle colonies because that's a lot of what they did in the middle colonies. Traveling a little bit further south, starting at Maryland, which I would still consider up north for me, but at this time it was a little different. But Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Notice we haven't gone any more southern than Georgia. We'll get into the reasons why behind that. Hint, it's owned by different people at this time other than the English. And again, it was when you get down to the southern colonies, you start to realize that slavery is a lot more common here than it is in the other colonies. And probably one of the biggest reasons behind that was because of the very, very rich soil and warm climate, which allowed for crop growth to take place a majority of the year. I mean, if you think about it, you're growing crops all through the spring, growing crops through all the summer, growing crops into a good portion of the fall. And there are even some things that you can grow through the winters, something really, really hardy like kale you can kind of get by with growing if you take care of it just right. And because of all of these giant farms, they had these massive things, these massive, massive farms. This weren't just like small families like farming and getting a little extra and selling in a market. These were massive farms that grew tons and tons of crops And they did that for a very specific reason, not to necessarily use at home, but to sell. And they called these things cash crops. Tobacco, cotton, rice, sugarcane, indigo, which was used for dyeing, were all grown on these different plantations and all these cash crops. And the southern colonies relied on the slave labor in order to make even more money. They looked at it as, if I can get someone to do this and I don't have to pay them a wage, I don't have to worry about giving them a living wage or giving them like a paycheck each week, I'm forcing them to work against their will, then I'm going to make more money, was kind of the approach that they took to that. Not everybody that lived in the southern colonies lived on plantations. Many of the colonists lived on small farms. So it was like that family who said, I'm going to farm, kind of like the video that we watched. I'm going to get up in the morning, I'm going to do the farming, I'm going to work with the animals, and you sustained yourself. You survived on your own through your farm. Farms in the southern colonies are actually kind of far away from each other. So because of this, it wasn't like there were a lot of these meeting houses where decisions were being made. And because there's no meeting house, if you go, if we went back in the slides, we'd see that's where the church services took place. Religion didn't have as big of a role. It wasn't as centralized in the southern colony life. Now, I'm not saying that they had no religion. They absolutely did, but that was probably more led by the dads of the house and the moms of the house, and they led those things in their family, but there weren't these giant meetings at churches because these farms were just too far apart. Again, if you're thinking about this meeting house, if there's things that are too far apart, you probably didn't have schools as well, a local, like, centralized school. So children were taught at home. Again, boys learned things from their dad, girls learned things from their mom. Some people were able to hire tutors, but you had to be pretty wealthy to do that. The children of the less wealthy families who weren't able to have private tutors learned things from their parents. They would learn to read and write, and that's if their parents knew how to read and write. If the parents didn't know how, well, they certainly couldn't teach the children how to read and write as well. Like I already said, the southern plantations relied on the work of African and African-American slaves. There were more slaves in the southern colonies than there were in the New England and Middle colonies combined. By the 1750s, the slaves made up half of the population of the southern colonies. So half of the people that lived in the southern colonies then were free. The other half were slaves. Again, slaves worked long hours in pretty harsh conditions. Hot fields in the summer, pretty cold in the winter, pretty brutal. Lots of rain in that spring and fall time. Again, even if a small mistake, maybe if they're working with a rake and the rake breaks, they were blamed for it and they were beaten and whipped by the overseers. And when slaves had children, these children were not born free. They were born into slavery. It was illegal for slaves to learn how to read and write. So again, we're looking, and we'll dig into this as we get a little further on. But as you can tell, just on the surface of this, not treated in a humane way whatsoever. I've said the word plantation a few times, so I just want to define that really, really quickly. It's a large estate where cash crops like cotton, tobacco, or sugar are grown. And it's taken care of by the workers that live on the property. And again, back in then, these workers were slaves that lived on the property. We will stop there. We're just about to run out of time. Be sure to go back into your notes. Be sure to use things that we've learned about the northern, the middle, and the southern colonies. Compare and contrast those in the newspaper template that you have. Take your time and work on that. And we will see you again for social studies on Wednesday of this week.